So as you know, I'm going to be speaking about this new book, which was co-authored totally with Katie Davis. She really has as much right to be the first author as I, but to be frank, the publisher insisted in putting my name first, which actually she now likes, because when it gets a bad review, they just mention my name. and we've come up with this appellation, the app generation, in an effort to describe the effects that the new digital media may be having in many, if not most, of our young people. We focused in our study on kids who were older than the Children's Museum population. This is basically about tweens and teens, but I think the description is more universal. So what's an app? Probably everybody here uses apps, and yet to define exactly what an app is not completely obvious. So we describe apps as procedures which allow you to carry out discrete tasks. They're quick. You activate the app and it walks you through what you have to do. And it provides a shortcut. We wouldn't use an app if it was more complicated or more multi-step than just doing it applessly. Never thought about that before. And there are many, many apps. Apple alone has created over 1 million apps. And they are just about everything, but they're highly structured. You go into an app and basically it leads you from one step to another. Very important, which I wasn't aware of until we began to think about this seriously, is apps are recognized and thought of in terms of a brand-like icon. So there's the Amazon shopping cart, there's the Facebook F, the Twitter bird, and even if you, no matter where you go, if you see that F, you know it's Facebook. And this defining by a brand-like icon, which clearly existed before the digital media, is now a very important part of almost everything we do. Without knowing anything about what goes on in the boardroom, I'm sure people at the Children's Museum spend a lot of time deciding what to name things, what configuration to give, and so on. And the reason for emphasizing this point is it's not lost on our kids. It's not lost on your kids. So we talk about what it means to live in a world which is saturated with these quick, efficient, brand-like means of doing things. Why do we call it the app generation? Your tweens and teens, they're apps for almost everything. So you can go through life basically looking down at your pad or phone and going from one app to the next. This gives rise to a hypothesis which is probably more true for your kids and grandkids than for the random child, but that parents and kids begin to think of life as a set of apps. First, you got to go to the right preschool. I was talking to Michael about preschool work that's going on here. Then you got to go to the right elementary school. When you go to high school, you've got to take the right courses, the right AP courses, the right extracurricular activities, write the right kind of essay. Then you got to go to a good college, and everybody wants to send their kids to a good selective college. And when you get there, you know, not only do you have to major in the right thing, but you have to have the right number of co-curricular activities, the right number of internships. And then, of course, the next option is, do you go to work in Hollywood, do you go to work on Wall Street, do you go to work in management consultancy? But maybe it's a good idea to spend 2 years, but not more, and teach for America. And we call this super apps because it's possible to think of life as just one app after another. Of course, once you think about it, life is almost never like that. Even if your name is Clinton, it's not like that. And yet the way of thinking that things are structured and you need to go to the next step and you can't fall off the train because you might not get back on again, we think this is a very powerful mentality for young people today. And then what happens if there is no app? One of the astounding things, which I, again, had to realize when I began to study this is that most kids nowadays have never gotten lost. They've never gotten lost. Because if they don't have the smart device, their parents do. Now, one of the things about getting lost, and I spent most of my life getting lost, Michael got lost on the way over here because he's busy talking, is you do find your way. But if everything is so structured that you never have that opportunity, that can be costly. So, is living in a world that is replete with apps, and where so many things can be done quickly, efficiently, brandly, and so on, is that good or is that bad? It's good if apps are enabling. That is, if they open up vistas you haven't had before, allow you to ask questions you haven't asked before, allow you to explore new places that you haven't before. But it's not so good if you become dependent on apps, so that if the first time you forget your phone, or the first time that there's a cyber attack and all of the wireless goes off, you have no resources in which to rely. That's pretty bad. So we don't want to have a world in which people are so dependent on apps that if something happens, they're completely lost. In the book, and maybe I should say a word because I'm not sure there's a slide about this. What did Katie Davis and I do with a number of other researchers at an organization called Project Zero? Wendy Fishman, whom many of you know, I hope she doesn't think she's worked there for too many years, but as far as I'm concerned, you haven't worked there enough years. At Project Zero, we had a study where we followed many kids. Sometimes we interviewed them, sometimes we observed them. Katie Davis surveyed 2,000 and interviewed hundreds for her thesis. We then we had focus groups. And one focus group brought together teachers, another focus group brought together psychiatrists, actually psychoanalysts, 14 psychoanalysts in the room. You could probably think of a few jokes about that. Another of religious leaders, another of camp directors. And in each case, we simply asked these people, all of whom were of a certain age, how are kids different now than they were 20 years ago? We picked 1990 as a kind of a pre-digital era as compared to 2010. And we didn't even mention the digital media, but you can be sure there wasn't anybody who didn't mention the effect of computers, the effect of games, of virtual realities, et cetera, et cetera. And that was very, very illuminating. I'll tell you an anecdote about camps. At camps nowadays, they sometimes have a burial service, and you have to take your smart device and bury it for the summer so that you will be device-free. It turns out that parents give their child a teddy bear, and in the teddy bear, what do? They sew an extra device. So even though the burial has taken place, the kid can still play and contact home and so on. Then, and I will talk about this later, we also looked at children's artistic productions and literary productions over a 20-year period. So we have a lot of data, more data. I mean, every day a book comes out about the digital generation. You know, you can't pick up the Boston Globe without seeing a book or article about it. But a lot of them are much higher on speculation than they are on data, and our findings really come out of the studies that we did. We focused, as the subtitle of the book indicates, on three constructs, each of which begins with the letter I: identity, intimacy, and imagination. And these come out of my own teachers from over 50 years ago. David Riesman is a famous sociologist, wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd. Actually, a co-author was Nathan Glazer, who happily is still with us. Not too many people who wrote books in 1950 are still with us. And then Erikson, well, probably more of you know his name, a great psychoanalyst who was my tutor when I was a student. So David Riesman, as you may remember, actually if you're my wife you remember, because in 7th grade when she did something which she shouldn't have done because the rest of her class was doing it also, her punishment was from her parents she had to read The Lonely Crowd. Now I don't know whether she actually did or not, but Riesman did a conspectus of American history. He said people who came over in the 17th and 18th century were tradition directed. They remember the old country and they wanted to live like their parents and grandparents, had the same religion, the same customs, and so on. In the 19th century, after the Revolutionary War, Riesman et al. Argued that people were inner-directed. They had their own gyroscope or compass. They did what they thought was right. They were going to the frontier. There really weren't models there. This is, the John Wayne, blah, blah sort of stuff. And then, this was the interesting hypothesis from 60, 70 years ago, time of mass media, time of living in suburbs, keeping up with the Joneses, was the time of other-directedness, namely that people who lived in America in the middle of the 20th century always were very cognizant of their neighbors. I remember once, this was a kind of I'm not very proud of this, but when most people in the neighborhood had a Volvo, so we went over to people who didn't and said, everybody here has a Volvo. You probably should have a Volvo too. That's an other-directed kind of thing to do. So our argument, as you probably anticipated, is in our time, our young people are very app-directed. They look at the apps available to them, the apps available to other people, and the apps often come to encompass an uncomfortably high number of options which they consider. So Erikson, and as I say, probably more of you remember, Erikson had this theory of the life cycle, and there were 8 life crises beginning in infancy, when the first year of life was the crisis of trust versus mistrust. And if you established the feeling of trust, that was a great partner, a great comfort for the rest of your life. But by the time you got to be in adolescence, the crisis was whether you would be able to form a solid sense of identity, be comfortable with it, other people would be comfortable with it, or whether you would have what Erikson called identity or role diffusion. You would try many different options and never really quite sure who you were and never were comfortable within your skin, or other people weren't comfortable with your identity. Then in young adulthood, and this is one of many areas where Sherry Turkle has really been the trailblazer. The Eriksonian young adult crisis was, are you able to form an intimate relationship with loved ones, with friends, or for some reason are you unable to do that, and so you have only superficial relations, or you're highly isolated. And you remember Sherry Turkle's book is called Alone Together, and that's a lovely oxymoron. In a sense, it almost bridges Riesman and Erikson also, and Sherry and I have talked a lot because she was a student when I was, and we had the same mentors. And then, going well beyond the Children's Museum, but still something to keep in mind, the crisis of midlife is generativity versus stagnation. Generativity is, do you create something new? A family? Do you raise the family? In your work, are you doing something where you're putting your own mark on it? Or are you stuck in a rut? Now, we wanted to have 3 I's, identity, intimacy, so we substituted for generativity or creativity, imagination. It works in English, but I've gotten letters from the Romanian publisher and the Chinese publisher. What shall we do? Because the 3 I's don't work there, but sorry. So I've already told you about some of our data sources. Some of the things which we got from these interviews without particularly asking about the digital media were surprising to me, particularly this. I never thought that I would hear over and over again from adults in midlife who had taught kids for 20 years or run camp for 20 years or done psychoanalysis for 20 years, that kids nowadays are very risk averse. unless you tell them to take a risk, in which case, of course, it's not a risk. And that stunned me until I began to think of my own teaching. I see Mike Connell, who was a teaching fellow here. When I began to teach decades ago, I would give it an assignment. I'd be sort of surprised if someone said exactly how many pages is it, exactly what type it should be, show me models of it, what percentage is going to be for this aspect and that aspect. But now it's almost expected that everything will be outlined precisely. But I hadn't thought about it until this emerged from our interviews. Kids expect quick answers. One of my favorite anecdotes, which actually involved me, I was talking about this sort of stuff a few years ago, and a bright young man, maybe 20, came up to me and said, kind of belligerent, I won't say belligerently, but kind of upfront, Dr. Gardner, when you have answers to all the questions you could possibly want, why should you even have education? Why should you go to school? And I looked at him and said, I didn't say sunny, but I thought sunny. Yes, the answer to all questions except the important ones. But even at Harvard College, and there's no more elite school, the number of students who explicitly shy away from courses where the questions are more important than the answers is really a shock. And I'm very much involved now with the college. I haven't been until the last 6 or 7 years. But to help young people understand it's a privilege to be able to deal with difficult questions rather than something that you should wipe off the slate. That's a big difference too. On the positive side, young people in our studies and in our interviews with older people are more tolerant. They're more accepting of people who have different racial, ethnic, sexual, global orientations than they were generations ago. I might say than they were in the Don Sterling era. And that's good, though that doesn't mean there's no bullying, and I'm sure that's something that you all have talked about. And hyper-connected. This is, of course, an enormous difference. When I went to college, I may have called my parents once a week, or vice versa. You went to Europe, if you could manage it, so they wouldn't have to be in touch for months. And that's not because I didn't love my parents, I did. But now, of course, whether it's elementary, high school, college, kids are online, messaging all the time with the other members of the family. That's good and it's bad. We get many complaints about how children are being handled by college parents. My wife, who teaches, has had parents threatening to sue because the child didn't get a good grade and wanted to go to medical school, etc. And I wouldn't have known this till this morning, but I've actually been sick for the last several months, so I've been catching up on old Chronicle of Higher Educations. And they're actually, I would have laughed at this some years ago, we actually now have parents intervening at the graduate school level. What does this kid have to go to get into this graduate school, and what can I do for it? And that would have been inconceivable as any kind of a generalization years ago. So what I want to do now, because I do want to leave time for discussion, is give you kind of the headlines from each of these three I's, then talk a little bit about something which I was encouraged to talk about, but it's part of the talk anyway, so I'm glad to do that, and then conclude and open it up. So, on identity, actually when kids first began to become involved with computers, Sherry Turkle said, this is going to be wonderful for identity because you'll be able to explore various different persona, various different avatars and virtual realities or games and so on. But once social media came on the scene, Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr and all those things, it changed completely. And the pressure now is on the package itself. Just like, everything Google does, you can be sure that there are hundreds of people inputting it and exactly how to describe it so they won't get sued or blown up. Similarly, kids have to look good, and they spend an enormous amount of time thinking about what persona they want to put forth in, I'll use Facebook because it's the most familiar. And, of course, when you're an adolescent, things are sometimes not very happy. But you look at all these picture-perfect identities that are posted, and you may feel you have to do the same thing. Much more depressing is you feel very bad if everybody looks like they have their act together and you don't. And the statistics, I forget them, the amount of time that young people, this is tweens and young teens, spend looking at other people's Facebook entries, home pages, even people they don't know, hours and hours, and it's not designed to make you feel good. But if you don't have a package self, you are an anomaly. The package self rarely deals with problems, conflicts, anxieties, because again, that doesn't look good. But again, as we well know, adolescents have a lot of them, but that's not part of the package self. I mean, Facebook doesn't tell you all the things that's wrong with Facebook, right? That's not how you get to be a billion-dollar company. And there are two possible trajectories. This comes out of Katie's thesis. One is premature identity consolidation. Before you're ready to say, this is the kind of person I am, this is the kind of person I want to be, this is my public brand, you find yourself being pressured to do that. Or you're not able to get it right, and so you try one thing after another, and you end up having a very fragmented identity. We actually have fascinating data on this, which hasn't been published yet, but if you promise not to tell anybody, we'll tell you. The data have to do with kids who present themselves differently on different social networks. And we also have longitudinal data on what happens as you get older and more wary of how employers, for example, looking at your things, the photographs of you on a drunken Friday night, which you don't really want them to see. And so, it's hard for a 15 or 16-year-old who is in a heavily social media world to navigate that, and it doesn't make identity consolidation any easier. Intimacy. We've already talked about the kids are always connected. And if you see 7 kids waiting for a bus, it's hard to make eye contact. And many doctors, pediatricians, infantologists worry about that. And what does it mean if your parents are always looking down rather than looking at you? What possible loss might they be with a lack of face-to-face contact? And we know that kids nowadays are very, very reluctant to have in-person confrontations, criticizing somebody, breaking up. Much prefer to do that as remotely as possible with a message or a posting. Many people learn that they've been broken up with by the person posting it just on their Facebook site. And of course there's pain connected with this, but part of having intimate relations with people is you have to be able to deal with the pain. You have to be able to confront it. You have to be able to work it out, look at somebody, get the reactions. Intimacy doesn't work too well asynchronously, and yet a lot of the communication now is asynchronous. We talk about more and more relationships that young people have with one another and with other people as being transactional. They're kind of designed to get something done and move on to the next thing. And of course, we all do transactional stuff. That's what happens in a society with many weak ties. But optimally, why do we have experiences like going to college, falling in love, raising a family? These are supposed to be transformative. They're supposed to be things which really make you into a more full person. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think about kids. And I often think about people who don't have kids either. They don't have their own kids, or they don't teach, or they don't work with kids. And in a sense, you can certainly have a life, but it's not. Having kids is a big transformational experience. But if you're used to everything being transactional and not looking face to face and just saying, what's the next app, that can be a threat to intimacy. So what we did in the area of imagination was, I think, the most interesting. We looked at kids' visual art, their graphic productions, and their writing over a 20-year period. let me see if that's on the next. Yeah, we looked at visual art in Teen Ink. Many of you will know that locally produced magazine. These are some of the works that kids produced. And we had them scored blind. What that means is the scorers did not know whether the works were produced in 1990 or in 2010. And we did the same thing with writing. We had kids' stories from 1990 and 2010, and they were scored blind. So let me ask you a question. Now, you can't answer it if you've read the book, but how many of you think that kids' imaginations have gotten better in the last 20 years? Raise your hand. Don't be afraid. Okay, just a few. How many of you think they've gotten worse? More of you. Well, the answer is you're both wrong, but it was a trick question. Actually, there was a piece on Common Sense Media yesterday on Morning Edition on this topic. What we found, and whether something is more creative or imaginative is value judgment, but we scored these graphic productions on many different dimensions. And in a word, we found was that the more recent graphic productions got higher scores on degree of rendering in a work, on whether there was sort of a classic centered things or things were cropped, whether the number of media that were used. And what we found was we had 18 different dimensions. It's described in great detail in the book, that by and large, people thought the more recent graphic works were more interesting and gave them higher scores on these dimensions. In the case of writing, again, 20-year, the differences were not in the favor of the younger kids. There was a lot more fantasy, magic, craziness in the early 1990s. Late 2000 was more just mundane, like a newspaper story. First did this happen, then this happened, then this happened, and kind of, the sorts of things that would happen. We got up in the morning, we got dressed, we went to work or school, not once upon a time and blah, blah, blah. The earlier works would have flashbacks, flash forwards, sort of play with the structure of genres, where the more recent ones are just one thing after another. This is very interesting. This is, I think, discovered by Emily Weinstein. When I say it's discovered, some things we knew we were going to look at, but other things just emerged when we began to look. The earlier stories were much more either first person I or second person you, which is sort of more unusual for a literary production, whereas the more recent ones were the typical, first this happened, then this happened. And then this is something that I don't know is more or less imaginative, but there's a lot of slang and cursing and informal language in the recent stuff, undoubtedly connected with Carol's tweets and so on. I was making a joke. Nobody's laughing. When you have 140 characters, you got to be snappy, right? You can't be like a professor. So the takeaway is that Marshall McLuhan was right. The medium matters, and once you hear the result, it's not surprising. But in this piece on Morning Edition yesterday, which I think has been pretty widely publicized, almost no American kids read for pleasure anymore. It's like 2%. And we could talk a lot about why that is. But if you don't read for pleasure, then the chances that you're going to make something, enter into another world is lower. I actually wonder where Harry Potter fits in, because most kids did Harry Potter. I guess maybe, I'm not sure they do that now. This was an experiment which I just read about in the course of writing the book, and the people who invited me here said, say something about play. And it's actually a very interesting experiment. I don't know whether people here know it or not. It was done by Elizabeth Bonowitz, who is a very good developmental psychologist. And basically, the experiment involved kids being shown a fairly complicated toy or gizmo with lots of different parts. And there's the experimenter on the right, and there's the kid, it's a 4-year-old, on the left. And there are two contrasting conditions. In one condition, I'm the experimenter, and I say, hi, welcome, I'm going to show you a wonderful toy. Let me explain to you how it works. This does this, this does this, this does this, this does this. Now I have to go out. Can you please play with it? Condition number 2 takes the same number of words, the same amount of time, but instead of say, oh, this is a toy, let's try this. Ah, that didn't work. Let me try this. Ah, what a surprise. Basically, the experimenter is indicating that he or she doesn't know exactly how it works, but wants to try to figure it out. So the dependent variable is how much time does the 4-year-old spend playing in the complete demonstration where you're told exactly what to do, as opposed to the aborted one where you know that it can make sounds, it can make lights, but you don't know how. So let's take a vote here, a Children's Museum vote. How many people think that the kids who are shown exactly what to do play longer? Okay, one brave soul, thank you. How many think that the kids play longer when, as my kids would say, the experimenter was kind of a doofus? Okay, well that's right. But it's a very important finding, because it says that if you want to stimulate curiosity, or in our terms, app enablement versus app dependence, you don't want to lay stuff out exactly, because then it becomes cut and dry. Do I have to tell anybody in this room what all the pressures in our educational system are nowadays? It's not for open-ended doofuses. Okay, this is some of the things that the device could do. And here's these are all from the same experiment, the kids sort of looking around and trying to figure out what to do. So I'm going to move now toward the conclusion, back to apps. This was enabled by Victoria Nichols, who is an assistant of mine. There's a drawing app called Doodle. This is a terrible tongue twister. Doodle Buddy. I have trouble getting it out. Any of you here know Doodle Buddy? Oh, some of you do. Good. Well, anyway, so what Victoria did is she took Doodle Buddy, and she picked out color and a certain thickness, and she made a little picture. Now, you can do Doodle Buddy in a different way, same application, but there are a lot of pre-programmed, prefab images, and so you can call them up and get them in perfect shape, kind of in like the complete demonstration of Elizabeth Bonowitz, and you end up having a perfectly credible work, but basically you didn't have much to do with it. All you did was select the parts. So we're interested in what is the balance in a young person's life between being given apps where they can take off and draw their own trees, as opposed to ones where everything has already been prefab, so to speak. And here is my most educational part of the talk. One thing you can do as an elder is model app enablement. Use apps, but show how you can use them in ways which may not have been expected, or put them aside, or take turns, complexify the app. App transcendence that's the height. That's when you just say, we're going on a vacation and nobody's taking their devices. And there's a lot of research to suggest that actually after the first few days, people like that. Have any of you done any vacations like that? Teach computational skills. I mean, now coding is the biggest thing, so I don't have to encourage it, but it's much better if you can create or manipulate the apps. And designers should be encouraged to create apps which move you toward the doofus facilitation rather than simply everything cut and dry, one thing after another. Here's where my value judgments come through, if they haven't already. I don't want to live in a society where people are app-dependent. I'd much rather live in a society where people are app-enabled. App-transcendent, and I wanted to show a slide here. Oh, yes. Steve Jobs was app-transcendent because he created apps. We're responsible. He's responsible for our app world, and yet he never would let anybody else tell him what to do. And so he's my poster child for app transcendence. Did any of you happen to hear Walter Isaacson's lecture last night? You heard it, Michael? I mean, it was a hymn of praise to Jobs, but also to other people who, Franklin and Einstein, people just like us, right? Who didn't just do what everybody else was doing. So this is a very interesting quotation. Whitehead was a famous philosopher, and he said this quotation, which is repeated all the time at conferences where people are app and digital files. And that is, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which you can perform without thinking about them. And when you first hear that, you say, yeah, that's great. But the more we thought about it, the more we thought that this was actually moving toward app dystopia, because you're letting somebody else decide what's important. And I'm not going to talk about it today, but I'm actually giving a talk, as some of you may know, on Thursday on the book at the Harvard Club. And there I'm going to talk a bit about the novel The Circle by David Eggers and the movie Her. And these are both literary, they're artistic endeavors to talk about what's a world where, in fact, the important operations are all turned over to somebody else. And some people think that's great. If Ray Kurzweil were here, I'm sure he would think it was great. I don't. So I'm going to end by reading a conversation with Oscar, my grandson, when he was 6 years old, because I wanted to know what he thought about all this. He calls me Opa. So Opa says, what would happen if I took away your iPhone? Oscar, I wouldn't be sad. I'd still have a computer. Oh, what's it like? Bigger than my mom's. A real Freudian answer. What do you do on it? Search on toys, go to .com, do something like HeroFactory.com, little things. I can write a little code into the line so I can play some sort of game. Opa was a bit taken aback at Oscar's ease with terminology and activity. So I asked, did you ever Google anything? Oscar says, I Google everything. Amazon, like anything I need to go to Google or write it down. Opa, you sound a bit exasperated. Oscar, kind of, but I'm not sure I know what exasperated means. Opa, I grew up without computers. What do you think that was like? And this is very interesting. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Oscar says, people would do all chores and more chores and more chores and no fun. Opa, no fun? A little bit, but not much fun. And then he goes on to say that adults in general don't use computers for fun, and he wouldn't want to be an adult because he wants to use it just for fun. So at the end, I decided to ask him kind of more generally about what he thought about, I called here his digital worldview. Opa, how do you feel when your parents say, put it away? Oscar, I feel a little blue, says this kind of plaintively. Opa, how would you feel if your parents took all your computers and phones away for a few weeks? Oscar, I'd feel a little blue, but I could actually have a little more freedom. Play with my toys, play with Aggie, who was then 8-month-old, go to places with mom and dad. What do you mean by freedom, says Opa. Oscar says, mostly people have technology. This is his word, not a word that I gave him. They're watching every game and making brrr, doing it all day, and don't do anything else, just watch TV. So if you have no longer have your apps, you can play with toys and things like that. And there is Oscar. I thought it was very interesting that this 6-year-old was already, totally into the world of digital apparatuses and apps, and just about every 6-year-old is, I know almost no exception, and he deplored that if adults use, they don't use it for fun, but he had already had this sense that you might give something up, and that there was reasons for maybe transcending for a while.
Dr. Gardner, I was wondering if you could comment on the digital classroom, on educational apps and the relationships between teachers and students. And does this mean that education is going to become transactional instead of transformational?
Well, I love the last part of your question, and I worry about that. You may be surprised, I'm not an opponent of the Common Core. I think there are reasons why in this country we need it, though, as I often joke, what the country wants is Massachusetts performance with Mississippi budgets. And this state's pretty healthy in education compared to almost every other state. But I think the transactional view, which comes really out of business and government, not particularly out of educators, has become very, very powerful in this country. And I don't think there's nearly enough appreciation of what the costs may be. I mentioned the decline in reading. If reading is something you're being tested on and have to do it in a certain way with certain texts, that's going to make you pretty, it's going to make reading toxic, which would be the case if your parents and teachers are reading to you and you're given time to read what you want. I mean, one thing that bothered many people is that the whole fiction category has been really minimized in Common Core in favor of social studies. I think in the future, already now, all educational institutions are going to have lots of digital devices, and I think that's fine. But I don't think they ever should be completely digitalized. I'm much more in favor of MOOCs for learning computer skills than I am for, doing philosophy. Also, and this is the point I make when I'm speaking to educators, you should never decide what to teach primarily by what's available online. Teaching is a value decision, one which in the best educational systems like Finland, teachers have a lot of say in what they teach and how they teach it. Once you've figured that out, and it's a constant, you never really figured out for good. I've been teaching for a long time. I'm constantly rethinking it. Then, how can you use the digital media? And for some cases, it's terrific, and for others, it really leads you in another way. But one of the problems we have in America, more than almost every other place, is there's much more money for technology and for buildings than there is for human resources. And once you get the stuff, you sort of feel you have to use it, whether or not it's the best thing for what you want to accomplish educationally. Mike Connell, what's your company?
Native Brain.
Native Brain?
Yeah.
Okay. .com?
Yes.
Look it up. Yeah. Now Mike is at the forefront of thinking about cognitive science and neuroscience and how that might give us clues about how to teach. And you've done some work with museums. Okay. Again, if you could catch there's a gentleman back there, but if you, okay, fine, thank you.
Dr. Gardner, I was curious about your conversations about identity, and if young people are really in a society that forces premature identity consolidation, what would you suggest ways to have them think differently about how to address this issue and really how to struggle with those challenges of identity in the teenager?
Okay, I like that question because you're reminding me of something that I've spent now 8 years working on, and it's something which may be catching on. We have, at Harvard College, but I've also done it at 2 other New England schools, we've developed what we call reflection sessions, reflecting on your life. And we bring young people together with somebody superannuated like me, and then somebody more Wendy or Mike's age, for several weeks where they just talk about what's important to them, what they value, how it relates to where they're coming from, what they're trying to achieve. Let me make it a bit more concrete, because we're doing it at Harvard College. The first week we talk about what did you bring to college and what did you leave at home? And of course that's metaphoric as well as literal. The second week we talk about what are the messages at Harvard College, explicit and implicit, convergent or divergent. Most of you have read about the Black Mass thing was supposed to be going on last night and was canceled. And that's the kind of thing we might talk about. Then the next week would say, 25 years from now, your home paper, whatever a paper means in 25 years, writes a story about you. What's the first paragraph? And this is designed to get kids out of their transactional mode and to think about issues which are important in their lives, but college goes by very fast. One of the most fascinating things we do is this. We give the kids a value sort. We give them 30 values. Wendy could probably give them to you backwards and frontwards, and they have to say what they value the most, what they value somewhat, what they value the least. Then the next week, completely unconnected, we say, make a pie chart of how you spend your week. And the kids, they're very assiduous. I spend exactly 2.7 hours a day on homework and 3.6 on Facebook and 1.2 dozing and so on. And then we ask them to put next to one another the values and how they spend their time. And they're shocked because, of course, there's no connection whatsoever. Would it be for me? I hope so. But so this long-winded way of saying is we have to create structures and processes and role models who think about these issues. And one of the most valuable things we do in these reflection sessions is things that kids worry about. They find out other kids are worrying about it too. But in this Facebook, everything's perfect. Two things I never thought that they would want to talk about were sleep and dating. And yet, they're obsessed with that, so it gives them a chance to talk with their peers. One of the sad things I will tell you is that the kids who need it the most, in my view, never take it, because it's a voluntary thing. At Stanford, they're making it a credit required thing, but we now have a group called PAVE. I never can remember exactly what it stands for, but I think it's something like Purpose and Value Education. And we've brought together 6 New England schools, very good ones, who are doing reflecting kinds of things. And we're going to create a website so any college or university can use these materials. So that's just one of 1,000 things you could do. But I think one of the biggest mistakes people of my age and maybe younger do is we assume that the world of the digital kids is the same as our world, and it's not. I'll tell you a shock. I think that Wendy was there in one reflecting session. I asked about the case of the dean at MIT who was dean of admissions and who got fired because she'd lied on her resume for 30 years. And to me, it was completely obvious. You can't be judging other people if you've lied on your resume. When we asked the students what they thought, they basically broke into 2 camps. One said, well, she's doing a good job, what's the problem? Which was, she probably was doing a good job. Number 2, well, everybody lies on their resume. So at this point I said, well, you shouldn't lie, it's in the 10 Commandments. But if you don't care about the 10 Commandments, if you lie in a resume, it is instant ground for being fired in any organization. That, I think, got their attention. Same thing with cheating. I have colleagues whom I like very much who are against an honor code at Harvard. They have no idea about how much cheating goes on in schools. And when the motto of the school is Veritas, and you tolerate cheating, and there are faculty members who get a slap in the wrist when they plagiarize, this is a different world.
One last comment is, we work for the YMCA of Boston. We run some camps. One of the most difficult issues we have is cell phones with parents, particularly in overnight camps. And now we confiscate teddy bears when they come to camp because it's very true. Thank you, Dr. Gardner.
Okay, thanks. Again, if you can catch the eye, yeah, good. Hi.
Hello, Dr. Gardner. I have a question. In your study, have you come across any correlations between the multiple intelligence and the use of the apps as it relates to identity?
Well, let me answer the question you didn't ask, and then I'll see if I can answer the question you did ask. As somebody who is guilty of espousing multiple intelligence ideas, I think the digital world is wonderful because there's so many more intelligences which people can easily deal with. I mean, music, graphic, as we get into more robotics things, bodily kinesthetic. So I think they're a real boon for, I mean, the best evidence for this is David Rose's work in Universal Design for Learning, where he says, it's not kids who are learning disabled, it's curricula that are learning disabled, and we have to find the curricula that work for kids, and all of his stuff is digital. So MI and digital are a happy combination. When it comes to identity, identity from my terms basically has to do with the personal intelligences. Obviously, identity involves a lot of intrapersonal intelligence, understanding yourself. But as I said earlier, it's also about whether your persona makes sense to the rest of the world. It doesn't help to have an identity you feel good about if nobody else can make sense of it and reject it and so on. So whether you're dealing with the digital world or non-digital world, identity is significantly the personal intelligences. And I guess what we're showing in our study is that it's dangerous to think there's a shortcut. And it takes time, it takes reflection, it takes trying out things. And as I mentioned, when the digital world first erupted in the 1990s and 2000, it was actually good for that kind of exploration. But the social media branding thing has really pushed it in a way which I think people aren't ready to consolidate their identity, particularly in a society like ours. Maybe in another kind of society, for better or for worse, the identity has to coalesce much earlier.
Could you speak a little bit about moral development and Facebook and things like that? Is it just trying out different identities?
Well, I'm going to make a suggestion, and then I'll say a word. Next fall, you should invite Carrie James here, because she's a part of our research team at Project Zero. 7 years ago, when Jonathan Fanton, the then president of the MacArthur Foundation, said to me, oh, we're studying the digital media, and we're going to find out all the ways in which kids are different cognitively, socially, emotionally. I said, Jonathan, who's about to move here, by the way, he's the new executive of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, what about their ethics? He said, gee, I never thought about that. So Carrie James has been spearheading a study called Good Participation about the ethical and moral landscape of young people. And she has a book coming out with MIT Press called Disconnected. It's a terrific book, and I couldn't scoop her even if I wanted to, because it's her research, not mine. But it turns out that by and large, kids don't have any kind of a ethical alertness about the kinds of things that can happen online which are damaging to other people, unless they themselves have been damaged, in which case they do have a sensitivity. But it's not the kid's fault, because nobody really knows how to model. We were studying 5 things, I forget what they were, but things like trustworthiness and intellectual property. Nobody knows how to deal with these things online. It's a totally different world. And the kids, 84% of the kids in the study said they wish they'd have role models for how to deal with the digital media morally and ethically. But we haven't figured it out either. That's what's on the front page of the newspaper every day, Is Edward Snowden a traitor, or is he a hero? And I give myself a little credit. Last summer at the Aspen Ideas Festival, I was in a room like this, but with all due respect, everybody had a few more zeros of money than you do. And I said, anybody who thinks they know whether Edward Snowden is a traitor or a hero hasn't thought about it enough. These are really difficult problems, and it's going to take generations to figure out how to have an ethical digital landscape, because the options are are so new. So why don't we take one more question if there is one. Catch the eye of way back there.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm really interested in the intimacy side of things and the relational side of things, both as a parenting educator and as a parent.
I'm missing the word relational.
Relational. So when 20-year-olds friend somebody on Facebook because they're concerned that if they don't, it'll get back to somebody else, even though the last thing in the world they want is that person seeing what they're saying to the world. And so I think your reflection idea was one suggestion that I kind of thought about, and I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts, because this generation doesn't know the before that you speak of, the childhood without it, and so they don't necessarily know what they're missing, and they don't have a benchmark.
Okay, well, I think you're asking two different questions. I always say as a parent, what doesn't happen in school becomes your task. And if reading at school is very transactional and very test-oriented, and kids actually tense up when they read because they know they're going to be asked 7 questions afterwards, you have to model a very different relationship to books, whether they're digital or physical, and talk about them. I mean, in Cambridge, dinner party talk is still book talk. So the joke is you can't discuss a book if you've read it, and that's why we're all expert on Thomas Piketty and Capital in the 21st century. But the Harvard Press doesn't care as long as you buy it. You were asking about relational. It's just so important whether when we ask our young people to do things, not to do things, that not only do we believe that's right, but we model it. The danger is that the devices are both seductive and they're very easy babysitters. And so one has to be willing to make extraordinary efforts. When I was young, reading was a lot more interesting than anything else, but I don't think that would have been true, if I were 70 years younger. So we have to change the landscape and be very mindful and explicit about why we're doing certain things. I always say 2 things about parenting, and if I can remember them, I will, and then we'll conclude. The first thing I say is, kids never listen to what you say, but they always notice what you do. And the other thing, which seems contradictory, but it's equally true, nothing said at the dinner table is ever forgotten. And when you think, and this I can give you 5,000 examples, when you think something that you've said wasn't noticed, 10 years later, you're nailed for it. And that doesn't mean that we won't make mistakes, but admitting that we've made mistakes and trying to do better is a very important part of teaching and parenting. Thank you.